All right then, so continuing with the presentation, what we want to do now is that we want to explore and clean each one of our variables. So I'll leave the examples for a minute and let's go back to the database that we have. And here we have each and every one of our variables as a column, and all of them have filters. So what we want to do now is go one by one on these filters. We select them and we just take a look at the information that we have. So in this case, everything seems to be corrected. We have from epi week 1 all the way to 53, which in some cases can happen. We go to the next variable, which is admission. And here we have the dates of admission. It's by year. If you click on the plus sign, it will give you the month, but we don't want to look at the month right now. I just see this one bizarre number here outside. It should be nested inside the 2022. I don't know what's going on. So what I do is that I unselect all. I just select this one. I go back here. This is June 26, 2022. I don't know why it's like that. So I just do 26th of June of 2022. And now I think everything is correct. It has been filtered correctly. So I clear the filter and I have everything I want. For the year, I do the same thing. All the year seems to be okay. What we want them to be categorized as easily as possible in terms of case number, the ages of patient. This way is impossible to analyze them. Some of the patient's age was recorded in years. Some of their ages was recorded in months. And let me see if I can find an example here. I have somebody who's 3.5 years. This one is 1.5 months, which actually means 1 year and 5 months. Again, 3.5 years, 3.5 years, 1.7 months, which I think it's 1 year and 7 months. This patient here has the age recorded in days. This is impossible to analyze. What we need to do is to select here and insert a new column and put the age again here. For this column, we'll have the age of patients. And all of them need to be in the same unit. In this case, I'm going to do the age in months. So actually, I'm just going to call it months. And it's very difficult to do this. The way I actually am going to work with this, that I'm going to select the age. I'm going to sort A to Z. And for each patient, I'm going to put the number here right by hand. So this patient is 12 months. This patient is 1 month, 12 months. Then this one is going to be repeated, this value. Again, this patient is 1 year and 2 months, I'm assuming. So it's 14 months. I'm just going to select and pull down. And this is a bit troublesome. It will take quite some time to do that. I'm not going to bore you with it. I'm just going to do it behind the scenes in a minute. But after it, I want to insert, I will also be doing an age category column. Age, yeah. Using the nested if, which I showed you a minute ago. All right. Continuing on, I will do this behind the scenes. For the sex, we can see that we have some M's, some F's, and some females. I actually going to select the females, and I'm just going to change this to an F. Now I only have M and F, right? And I'm going to do this for everything that we've seen, for all the variables that we have here. For the date of the start of the symptoms, we have numbers again. We have a few mistakes. We can select here. Let me see. So this date, which is in 1900, let's see, this is probably a mistake. I don't know which year this was, but we know that these patients were seen in 2021. So this is probably January 6th, 2021. And this one is January 9, 2021. I select all of them. I go to the specific one here, which says 2922, which is probably 2022. It's also probably a typing mistake. Just delete it and put in a 0. And so on. I'm just going to go through each one of the variables and I'm going to do the same thing. Again, I'm not going to bore you doing everything, but I'm going to use the if function, the nested if function, the wildcard if function to prepare this database so that we can analyze it together. Okay, I'll see you guys in a minute. Hello. So moving on with our presentation, let me share with you the work that I've done so far using that original table. So here we have the original data. Here on worksheet number 2, we have the ones that we've cleaned up. And let me just go very quickly through the variables to show you what has been done. So the admission date, I haven't changed this one. the year, the case number. What I've done is some cleaning up, and here's the first new thing that I did. It's a column with the month, which has the age of the patients in months. I actually did this by hand. There are ways to do it automatically, but it was just easier to do it by hand. Then next, I have a column, a variable for age categories. There are many age categories. It goes from 0 to 5 months, all the way to 50 years or older. The sex of patients, male and female. The village and district I did not touch. I cleaned up a little bit the ones with the symptoms. So for fever, rash, red eyes, coryza, or complications, we had yes or no. It's all as yes or blanks. And for treatment, I converted this variable into dummy variables. So for each one of the antibiotics, I have a yes or no column. So ceftriaxone, amoxicillin, azithromycin, or cloxacillin, as well as for vitamin A, right? So all of them have yes or no. So which patients did receive the medication? This one, for example, did not receive vitamin A. Yeah, the majority of them did. The admission is also a yes or no. And finally, for the cured patients, if you look here at the variables, there are a lot of things that are not cured. For example, discharge against medical advice, dead in the ER, ITFC, yes, referred to admitted. And for the death, the same thing, we have the dates in which many of the patients died. So what I did is to combine these two columns in a new one called outcome, which mainly has the outcome of the patient. If he or she was cured, discharged against medical advice, deceased, or referred to another facility, or if it's blank, okay? So this is our clean table, all right? And if you remember here on the table design ribbon up here, I did mention to you that we had a total row that we could use. Let me select this again. So now I have a new row here at the bottom, which I can calculate the totals if I want to. So for example, the case number, I can select here using this drop-down menu, and maybe I can see the sum. So it's adding up all the case numbers. So each patient has a unique number. So this is the total that we have. The addition of them is not so interesting to me as much as the count. So I have 700 patients, right? And what I can do using the single count here of unique numbers is to start to make some more calculations. So for example, maybe I want to see how many patients were males. So I just select males. I put this filter on this variable here, and now I have that 341 patients are male. I can actually write it down, males, and I have 341. And I can calculate females by doing the same thing. I go to the drop-down menu, I select females, and I know that 359 patients are females. Okay. I can clear the filter now. Maybe I'm also interested in, maybe, I don't know, seeing the outcome of patients. I want to see how many of them died. So I can come to the outcome here, and I can filter on deceased. Okay, so I've only the deceased patient selected, and I can see that deceased were 18 patients. Maybe I'm also interested in knowing how many of them were males and females, so I can put the two filters together. And now I have selected only male patients, which have deceased, and the number drops down to 7. And now I want to do the same thing for females. And I have that 11 females have died. You can see that this total row, excuse me, it's very useful to us. We can do a lot of calculation using them, but it's a bit difficult to work on this way, right? You have to select whichever filters you want, and then you have to go back to the count total column to see what you want to do. So let me just delete this over here. I'm also going to go back to the table ribbon, and I'm going to remove the total row. So there is one easier way of doing this, which is to, I still have the filter on selected for the deceased patients. Your filter. So now I have my table again. It's full of patients. I think I still have a filter for sex. So I've cleared all the filters. I have all my patients here. So one way to do the summarized calculations is to do a pivot table. So very briefly, let me share with you what is a pivot table. It's a table of grouped values that aggregates the individual items of a more extensive table. So it provides a summary, which might include sums, average, or other statistics. In our case, we're going to use counts a lot, and we can pivot the groups around. So I think the best way to show you what a pivot table is to actually go ahead and use this one as an example. So to do a pivot table, you have two ways of doing it. One of them is on the table design, you go to the summarize with pivot table on the table design ribbon. You come here to summarize with pivot table. Alternatively, and please remember, our name of the table is measles. We gave this table here the name measles. The other way to go, which we're going to do now, is to go on an insert. We click on pivot table, and a new window pops up. And it's asking me, where does the data come from? It's from the table measles. Where do we want the pivot table to be placed? We want it on a new worksheet. And okay, so let's just add it here. So now we can see that we've been moved to a new worksheet. We were on sheet 2. Now we're on sheet 4. We have this thing here that says pivot table 1. We have a new ribbon up here, which gives us also the name of the table if we want to change it. It has some options, which we're going to go through in a minute. But here on the right-hand corner, we have a new column, which has 5 windows. You can change the design by clicking here on the little engine thing. I usually like to work on them like this, but let's keep the original format. On this first window, we have the names of all of our variables, right? And here on the bottom, we have 4 more windows. One says filters, columns, rows, and the other one says sum of values. So what we can do is just let's select sex and see what happens. So now we see that the variable sex has appeared here on the rows, and that here on our table, in the place where we had the pivot table space, it says S and M, which are the sexes that we have. Let's remove this one and click on age category, and now it shows our age categories. Okay. Let's remove it again. If we choose a different variable, for example, month, it comes under the sum of values. And now, instead of months, I have the sum of months, and I have a very large number here, which actually, if we go back to our tables, what is this number? Let's go to our total row. It's basically this variable over here. It's the sum of months. So it's the same number, 40,700 something. Go back here, 40,700 something. Months is usually not very helpful to us, so we can just drag it out and remove it. So let's take the case number. So this is a unique case number each patient has. It's, again, this variable which we were counting before, but now it's showing us the sum. You can see it's the same number, 245,000, but we do not want the sum, do we? So we can click here and select the value field settings. And instead of the sum, we want the count. So now we have all of our patients represented. The 700 patients are represented here. And if on top of that, we select sex, what happens is that it's automatically showing me how many of my patients are females, how many of them are males, right? So this is very useful to us. So what a pivot table does is to actually summarize the information that we have. And of course, we can go a little bit further. Maybe we're also interested in the age category of patients. So you can see that the age category of patients now for females and males are selected here, but this is not the most legible way to read this table. Perhaps here we have rows and columns. Maybe we can take sex to the columns. So each row represents one age category, and here we have the columns for how many patients. So I have that 41 patients are males between 0 to 5 months, or 19 patients are females between 20 and 29 months, or so on. So this is how you use pivot tables. You can see that you also have another blank space here, another window which you can use, which says filters. So let's just add another one to see what happens. So let's put on a filter here. Excuse me. So let me unselect the year. So the best way to select what you want here, if you just click on it, Excel's going to try to guess in which window you want it. So what I'd rather do is just click select it and just drag it. So I'm selecting year and I'm selecting it to the filter window. It says year here. So now I have a year up here and I can apply a filter to it. So maybe I want to see only patients from 2021. So now I've applied my filter and this is only patients for 2021. So I know that in 2021, I had only 6 women between ages 20 and 29 years. So this is the basics of pivot tables. I'm going to stop this video now, and in the next one, I'm going to show you a bit more that you can do using pivot tables. See you in a bit. All right, so moving on with the presentation, there is something actually which I would like to get out of the way. If we look here at the first pivot that we constructed, I just zoomed in a little bit so we can see a little bit closer. You would notice that the age categories of patients, it's not in order. It's actually in alphabetical order, but it's not in the order which we want to, which would be to have this first one here between 0 to 6 months, and then 6 months to 12 months, and so on. So one thing that we can do to tackle this is that we select all of them. We press Control C, we go to any other blank space, we just paste it, pressing Control V. And now we have the age categories out of order. This is not the order which we want them. How do we fix this? Well, you go under Data, and then here you have the icon for Sort. You click on Sort. It opens up this window, which gives you a few options. We want to do a custom list. In this custom list, you can see that there's a list of days of the week and of month, but we want a new entry. So what we can do is that we enter this data in the order which we want to. So we can just go ahead here. I'm just going to paste it from somewhere else. So now it's in order 0 to 5, 6 to 11, 12 to 23, 24 to 59. Then in years, I'll add this. I'll click on OK. OK again. And now you can see that it's in order. All right. For this pivot table, which have already created, it's not going to work. It works for our next pivot tables. So this is just a quick parenthesis I wanted to do because this is something that really bothers me, and this is how you get out of the way. Even if you remove age category from the table, and then we add it to the table again, it's still going to be in the old order. Let's see. Yeah, it's not going to work for this table. But for the next one, maybe it will work. So, all right, I'll see you guys again in a bit. Continuing with the presentation. We have our pivot here. We did our first pivot, and one of the things that we can do is to create more than one pivot in the same spreadsheet. So here I have 4 spreadsheets. On the first one, I have the original data. On the second one, I have the data which I cleaned up for the analysis. On the third one, I'm doing the pivots. So if you select any cell here, you can just go under Insert, Pivot Table. It will ask you from which table you want the data from. In this case, it's measles. And voila, the table is created. Let's test if the age categories are now working in the order we want. Yeah, now it's in the correct order which we want. So I'm just going to recreate the first one that we have here in terms of age categories and sex. And of course, we need to put on the value. So it's the case number goes into the sum and value field settings. We want to count them. All right. So now we have the information that we want, but it's still not ideal. Like you have all the information. It's really great, but maybe you want to put a graphic here that will help you show this information in a more dynamic way. So if you have it selected, you can see that here on the pivot table analyze ribbon, you have the option to create a pivot chart. So if you just click on it, it's going to ask you what kind of chart you want. If it's a line chart, a pie chart, a bar chart, etc. Usually for this kind of age categories, we will use a lot of the times the column chart. It's a really helpful one. We can say OK. And now we have a pivot graph, right? And this graphic has all you can twerk it around any way you would any other graphic. So for example, I see that now this axis here is going from 0 to 100 and 120, and I want it to go to only 100. If I double click on it, all of a sudden I had format axis options here, and I want the maximum to be not 120, but 100. Okay, maybe I want the gap width to be a bit smaller than it is right now. I can just do that any way I want. So I can just go to diminish the gap width. Well, actually, it doesn't look very good if I do that. Let's keep it as more or less as it was. All right, so now you can also create a table, but you can also make a graph out of it if you want using the pivot graph. If you have the pivot graph selected, you have yet another ribbon up here, which will help you to format your graph any way you want to. And if you click directly on the graph, you can format and any way that you can do usually in Excel. All right, I'll see you guys in a bit. Okay, so continuing with the presentation, let me share my screen again. I think you have it now. What I did here, behind your back, what you're not seeing, is that I created a few new pivots, and for each new pivot, I created a new graphic. So I have one here which is telling me about the outcome, how many patients were cured, discharged against medical advice, deceased or referred. I have that first one which I showed you about the age and sex distribution of patients. And I have one down here which tells me how many patients have been seen per each epidemiological week. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to select one of them. Remember, for each one of them, we have the pivot table analyzed, and each one of them has the name. So this is actually pivot table 3, which is the third one I created. This one is pivot table 6, and the one down here is pivot table 4. Let me go into pivot table 3. And here on the pivot table analyze, I have the option to insert a slicer. Let me just click on that and try to show you what it does. So for a slicer, for example, you can see that it opens all the variables, a window with all my variables, and I can choose whatever slicer I want to. So for here, let me, for example, select, I don't know, the outcome of patients for this one, okay? So now you can see that a new thing has popped up, a new object in my window has popped up. Let me move it over here. It says outcome, it's the new variable. I can format however way I like it. Also, up here on the top, I have a ribbon specifically for the slicer. It says outcome. And when I select one of the options, for example, cured, you can see that my table has automatically changed and my graph has automatically changed as well, only to reflect the patients which were cured. I can select discharge against medical advice. And of course, now I have so few patients that it can barely see. There's only 21 patients. Deceased patients, the same thing, so few of them that we can barely see. Or I can select more than one by clicking on control. So now I have the deceased patients and the ones that were discharged against medical advice, both on the table and on the graph. Or maybe I want to see how many blanks I have. I can also click here and clear the filter and have all my options back again. So what the slicer is doing is that it's basically being another filter that I can use on this pivot table and on this pivot graph. But there's one important advantage that the slicer has, that if you look here on the ribbon of the slicer, I have the option to report connections. So if I select it, it will show all the pivot tables that I have. So I'll select all of them, click on OK. So now when I select an option on this slicer which I've created, it's going to impact all the 3 pivot tables that I have and all the 3 pivot graphs. Let's see, for example, if I select only patients who were cured, automatically the first graphic, since it has the same information, all of my patients were cured. We don't have any further information. The case per week has also changed. Let me just go back and forth. I'll bring this down here. Go back and forth. Like this is without filters, and these are only the patients which were cured, or only the ones who deceased. So now I see that the number of cases per week, keep in mind that the axis here has changed a lot, all the way up to 3 only, whereas before it was going all the way to 60. So by introducing a slicer, I can actually put on filters on all my pivot tables all at once. So I can select all of them doing all at once. And I can do more than one. So I'm going to stop the recording here. And in a minute, I'm going to show a few more slicers that I usually use when I'm doing this kind of analysis. OK, so I'll see you guys again in a bit. OK, so what I did here is that I created a few pivot tables. I have 3 pivot tables, each one of them associated with a pivot chart. And what I did is that I created a number of slicers which are connected to all of my tables and all of my charts. So all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 slicers are connected to all of my tables. And now I can look at the information whichever way I like. If I want to look at a specific group, for example, let's look only at the patients who did receive vitamin A. Automatically, I see that there were 21 who were discharged against medical advice, deceased were 18, and etc. So for the treatment, this is why we need those dummy variables. So we create for each one of the patients which medication they received, if we want to see. Same goes for the outcome or age categories. One of the things you might have noticed is that I used very unusual age categories. I broke it down in many smaller groups, so 0 to 5, 6 to 11. So perhaps you're only interested in children who potentially could receive the vaccine, which would be children 6 months to 5 years. You can select them here, the first age category, and just by pressing Control, you can select 3 groups. So now I have my own predefined age category, which is 6 months to 5 years. Or maybe I want to include children 0 to 6 months now, just select this one here now. So this is a bit how you use slicers, pivot tables, and pivot graphs. Of course, it looks very messy as it is right now. In a bit, I'm going to show you how to make it look a little bit neater, okay? I'll see you guys again in a minute. All right, then. So moving on, in my opinion, this is all very nice. We have the information that we want, that we need in this table here, in this images, but it's very polluted. There's a lot of information in it, which I usually don't like. When I'm sharing this data with somebody, this is usually too much for me. So one of the first things I like to do is that I go into any of the pivot tables that I have. I can go on my pivot table analyze ribbon and I remove the field list. So now those columns here don't appear anymore. So it's already a little bit more clean. Okay. One thing that I also like to do when I want to present such a table is that I go under the view ribbon, I remove the formula bar, I remove the headings, I remove grid lines. So there's a bit less information, right? So these are things you want to do. You can then move them around to make them look however you want. A lot of times I will just even put the slicers and the graphs on top and even hide all of my tables so that the information the people who are I'm sharing this with have are only the images. They don't actually see the numbers. This is up to each person to format however way you like it. Okay, I'll come back in a minute to show you how to refresh your data. All right, so now we have our tables, our graphs, our slicers, everything we want to. And in this case, in this example that I used, it was a fixed case, like there were no new patients being added to our table. But let's suppose that we have a table to which new patients are being added. And let's just give it this a hypothetical example. So we can go back here to the worksheet in which we have data. I'll go to the bottom of our table and I'll just put a new patient here. So this would be patient 701. Automatically, it says that let's give it a fictitious age. Let's say it was 48 weeks old. So this is the age category. In terms of sex, it was, let's put something new here just so that we recognize. Let's put an unknown. Unknown. What else can we do? For the outcome of the, let's see also. For the epi week in which this patient was seen, let's put a fictitious one as well, like 99. And I'm using this very bizarre thing so that we can identify them later, this specific patient, 701, in our pivot tables and graphics. And for the outcome, I'm also going to put something new, like I'm just going to write the word new. Okay, so now we have a new entry. It was a patient 701, which is 48 months old. The sex is unknown, and it was seen on epi week 99. When we go to our pivot tables, this patient is not here. The outcome is something new that is not even in this row. The age category, you can see that it has not changed. And even the epi week in which this patient was seen is not here. So to address this issue, what we have to do is to select any of the pivot tables that we have. We go under pivot table analyze, and then we select here refresh. And this opens up a drop-down menu, and we can ask to either refresh one or all of my tables. So let's click on refresh all and see what happens. So once we refresh all, we can see that new is here. So we can identify that this patient is here. It's also present in the graph now. The age category, now we have the unknown because the sex of the patient, we wrote down that it was unknown. So now we have this patient right over here. And the same goes for the epi week. It's way down in the bottom as being from epi week 99. So whenever you're adding new patients, your pivot tables and your pivot charts are not going to automatically update the information. You will need to come here and refresh the data. Okay. This is not usually something that people who are, if it's for yourself, it's fine the way it is. You can just go there and refresh as it is. But sometimes you want to share this pivot table with somebody, you want to share this analysis with somebody who's maybe not that familiar, that they have to select a cell inside the pivot table, then they go to the pivot table analyze ribbon and have to select the refresh button. So I'm going to show you another way to do it in just a second. All right, so continuing with the presentation, I want to show you something which is called Excel VBA. I don't want to go into details into this because this is such a huge topic and there's so many things for you to learn and so powerful Excel VBA. But I just want to show how to do this one very specific thing that I think can help a lot, which is to create some automatic way to refresh the pivot tables. So the first thing that you're going to do is that we're going to create a new ribbon here, which is not present currently. We go under File, then we go all the way down to Options. We select Options, and then on the Customize Ribbon here, we select Customize Ribbon, and then there's this thing called Developer, which has not been selected. I'm going to select the Developer, and I'm going to click on OK. So now I see that Developer ribbon has appeared here. Now I have something new, which is the Developer ribbon. This is what you use for doing Excel VBA. Okay, I'm not even going to explain what Excel VBA is today, but now you have this new ribbon. And what you can do is that you can record a macro. So once you click on record the macro, what Excel is going to be doing is that it's going to be recording every single thing that you're using Excel in that time. So I'll click on record macro. It's going to be called macro 1. It's going to be stored in this workbook. It's okay. And everything you can see now, it says stop recording. It is recording everything I do. So I go back to whichever one of my tables. I go to pivot table analyze. I select on refresh all. It's refreshing all. I go back to developer and I stop the recording, right? So now when I click here on this next icon here, I have macro 1 recorded. So we've recorded one macro. So if this is your first macro, congratulations. Very simple macro. We can run it if we want to. But of course, I'm doing this because it's using the refresh ribbon is not, the button is not so intuitive. This is even less intuitive, but I can just click on run and it will run the refresh button. So let's test if it's working. So I'm actually going to change this from Epi Week 99 to Epi Week. I'm going to give it also an Epi Week 60 and patient number. And the sex I'm actually going to leave as a blank. Okay, so if I go back to our ribbon, I'll go to our macro, I'll run the macro. And all of a sudden, instead of unknown, I have a sex which is blank for one of the patients. And instead of Epi Week 99, I have somebody on Epi Week 60. So our macro is functioning very well, right? So now we've created our first macro, and now we want to insert it somewhere. So I'm going to use back on the developer tab. I select insert. Here has control forms. I select a button here, button form control. It's going to, you can see that I don't have an arrow. I have an X now in my cursor. I'm just going to open it here. And now it has a button, which I have to assign a command. So I'm going to assign macro 1 to it. I'm going to click on OK. Now I have button 1, which I want to change the name from button 1 to refresh data, right? So now every time I click on this button, it's going to refresh the data that I have. So let's test if it's working. I'll go back to my original spreadsheet and I'm just going to change this from week 60 to week 80. And instead of blank, I'm just going to say this fictitious patient is a male. And instead of outcome new, I'm just going to write outcome test, right? This is all because I want to very clearly identify this as false information. Let's see if it's working. I click on the button that I had. And now instead of outcome new, I have outcome test. It's in my graph. I don't have that blank patient anymore. The number of male has increased by 1. And the Epi Week is now Epi Week 80. So this is how you create a button to refresh your data. Excel VBA is a huge topic. It has a lot of things that you can do using it, but today we're not going to go into details using it. Okay, in a minute, I'm going to show you how to save your work. All right, then. So for this last part, I want to share with you, this is perhaps the most important part of the entire presentation, which is how to save your work. You go under File, Save As. You select where you want to save it. So I'm just going to say this PC, let's on the desktop. And then let me bring up this window. It's going to ask for the name and how do you want to save? Save as type. Usually the go-to type is the Excel workbook, XLS. If you do that, you're going to lose everything that you have done. What you have to do is to save it as an XLSM, Macro Enable Excel Workbook. Otherwise, all of your pivots are going to be gone. All the refresh button is going to be gone. All of the work that you did is going to be gone. So you want to save your work as an Excel macro enabled workbook. Okay. So you click on Excel macro enabled workbook. You click on save, and now your work has been saved. Okay. Let me stop sharing my screen. So I have shared with you how I do exploratory data analysis using Microsoft Excel. I hope this has been useful to you. Maybe you already knew some of the things, but you can add some new things to it. Maybe you still do some things differently. In any case, I'm happy if I could be of any help to any of you guys. Thank you. I'll see you guys in the next presentation. Bye.